My name is George Whitman. I'm 81 years old, and I've been living with silence for 3 years now. 3 years since Margaret passed, leaving me in this house that once echoed with laughter, arguments, and the beautiful chaos of family life. Now, the only sounds are the ticking of her grandfather clock and my own footsteps on hardwood floors that seem to amplify my solitude. I was a history professor for 42 years, teaching young minds about the rise and fall of civilizations, the patterns that repeat themselves across generations. I understood the world through stories, through the lessons embedded in human behavior. But nothing in all those years of studying humanity prepared me for this particular chapter of my own story, the chapter where I became invisible to my own children. The morning routine has become a ritual of loneliness. Coffee for one, toast cut into precise triangles the way Margaret used to do, and the newspaper spread across the small kitchen table meant for four, the same table where Sarah once did her homework while I graded papers. I read every section now, even the parts that don't interest me, because time moves differently when you're alone. Minutes stretch like hours, and hours disappear without leaving any meaningful trace behind. I remember when this house was the center of everything. 3 children running through these halls, bringing friends home from school, filling every corner with noise and energy. Sarah, my eldest, used to sit right here at this kitchen table, working on her homework while I graded papers. Michael would practice piano in the living room, and little Emma would build elaborate castles with her blocks on the carpet where I now sit alone. The visits stopped gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice the pattern at first. Life, they said, was just so busy. Careers to build, their own families to raise, responsibilities that pulled them in every direction except toward the house where they grew up. I understood, or at least I told myself I did, because understanding seemed easier than confronting a truth I wasn't ready to face. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, especially to someone trained to recognize them. The calls became predictable, arriving not on birthdays or holidays, but always preceded by a certain tone, that careful, almost rehearsed warmth that I began to recognize as the sound of need approaching. It's remarkable how the human voice changes when it's about to ask for something. Sarah would call first, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness, asking about my health, the weather, anything except what she really wanted to discuss. Then came the pause, the subtle shift in tone, and the real reason for her call would emerge. The down payment for the new house, the unexpected medical bills, the opportunity that required just a little help to make it work. Michael's approach was more direct, businesslike even, with his own father. He'd skip the pleasantries and dive straight into spreadsheets and investment opportunities, explaining why helping him was really helping myself. His voice carried that confident authority he'd learned in corporate boardrooms, but underneath it, I could hear the same little boy who used to ask for money for ice cream. Emma, my youngest, broke my heart the most because her requests came wrapped in genuine tears and real desperation. She'd pour out her troubles, the divorce, the custody battle, the bills piling up, and I'd find myself reaching for my checkbook before she even finished speaking. Her pain was real, but I began to wonder if her solution always had to involve my wallet. The checks went out month after month, year after year, each one accompanied by promises to visit soon, to spend more time together, to make up for the distance that seemed to grow wider with each deposit. But the visits remained rare, brief, and somehow always connected to another request that required my financial intervention rather than my emotional support. I started keeping track, not out of spite, but out of a historian's need to document patterns. In the 3 years since Margaret's funeral, I had received 47 phone calls from my children. 41 of them had ended with requests for money. The other 6 were duty calls on major holidays, lasting an average of 12 minutes each, filled with updates about people I'd never met and places I'd never see. The mathematics were stark, undeniable, and heartbreaking. Over the past 5 years, 2 of them while Margaret was still alive, I had given my children nearly $200,000 in various forms of assistance. During the most recent 3 years, they had visited me a total of 11 times, most of which lasted less than 3 hours. I wasn't just doing the accounting of money, I was calculating the currency of love, and the exchange rate was devastating. Margaret used to warn me about this, in her gentle way. "George," she'd say, watching me write another check, "sometimes the kindest thing you can do is say no." I thought she was being pessimistic, that her illness was making her see shadows where there was only light. Now I understand she was seeing clearly what I was too afraid to acknowledge. The house felt different after I completed this emotional audit. The walls seemed to echo not just with silence, but with the weight of transactions disguised as relationships. I walked through rooms filled with furniture we'd bought together, books I'd collected over decades of teaching, photographs of children who had grown into strangers who knew my bank account better than my heart. That night, I sat in my study surrounded by all the artifacts of a well-lived life, and I realized I was facing a choice that would define not just my remaining years, but the legacy I would leave behind. The question wasn't whether my children loved me, it was whether they remembered how to love me without needing something in return. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in November, when the phone rang during dinner. I was eating alone as usual, but I had set the table properly with Margaret's good china because she always said we should treat ourselves with the same respect we show to guests. Sarah's voice came through the speaker with that familiar tone, and I found myself predicting her words before she spoke them. "Dad, I hope you're doing well. I know it's been a while since we talked." The script was so predictable that I could have written it myself. Health inquiry, weather comment, family update, then the transition phrase, "Actually, Dad, I'm calling because," followed by the request. This time it was $20,000 for what she called an investment in the children's future, a private school that would give my grandchildren opportunities they couldn't get elsewhere. I listened to her elaborate explanation, her carefully constructed arguments about why this money would benefit everyone, including me. She painted pictures of graduation ceremonies I might attend, achievements I could claim partial credit for, grandchildren who would thank me someday for the sacrifice. But all I could hear was the mathematics of manipulation, the way she had learned to frame her needs as my opportunities. When she finished speaking, the silence stretched between us like an ocean. She was waiting for my usual response, the questions about amounts and timing, the gentle probing about her finances, the eventual agreement wrapped in fatherly concern. Instead, I heard myself asking a question that surprised us both. "Sarah, when was the last time you called me just to hear my voice?" The pause that followed was longer than usual, filled with a discomfort neither of us was prepared to address. "Dad, you know how busy things are," she finally said. And in those 7 words, I heard the summary of our relationship. I was a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, a solution to be accessed when needed. I was no longer a person to be loved simply for existing. After hanging up that night, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying the face of a man I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. When had I become this person? When had I allowed love to be reduced to a transaction, affection to be measured in dollars, and my worth as a father to be calculated by my willingness to solve problems with money? The reflection staring back at me wasn't just older, it was smaller somehow. Diminished by years of saying yes when I should have said no, of writing checks when I should have demanded conversations, of enabling dependency when I should have encouraged independence. I thought about the lessons I had tried to teach them when they were young, the value of hard work, the importance of perseverance, the dignity that comes from solving your own. N problems. Somewhere along the way, my good intentions had undermined those very principles. My desire to help had become their excuse not to help themselves. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory, not with criticism, but with the wisdom I had been too stubborn to hear while she was alive. She had seen this pattern developing years before I acknowledged it, had tried to warn me that love without boundaries becomes indulgence, and indulgence ultimately destroys the thing it claims to protect. Standing there in the harsh bathroom light, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I would not continue to be an enabler disguised as a loving father. I would not allow my remaining years to be defined by other people's crises and my wallet's solutions. It was time to rewrite the rules of engagement, even if it meant risking relationships that might not survive without financial foundation. I spent the following weeks going through old photographs, letters, and mementos, conducting what I came to think of as an archaeological dig through my own life. Each box I opened revealed layers of relationship history, moments when love had been pure and uncomplicated, before money became the medium through which we communicated. Here was Sarah at 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing she had made for me that said, "Best Daddy in the World" in crayon letters. Here was Michael at 10, beaming with pride after I taught him to ride his bicycle, his face glowing with accomplishment earned through persistence rather than purchased with dollars. And Emma, barely 5, curled up in my lap while I read her bedtime stories, her complete trust evident in the way she relaxed against my chest. Those children had loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. They sought my attention, my approval, my time, never my money, because money wasn't part of their vocabulary yet. When had that changed? When did my value as a father become tied to my ability to solve their problems rather than teach them to solve problems themselves? I found letters Margaret had written to me during our courtship, filled with dreams about the family we would build together. She had written about raising children who would be kind, independent, and grateful. Children who would value relationships over possessions, who would understand that the greatest gifts couldn't be deposited in a bank account. Reading those letters, I realized that somewhere in our parenting journey, fear had overtaken wisdom. Fear that saying no would damage our relationships, that requiring independence would be interpreted as abandonment, that expecting gratitude would seem selfish. We had confused love with giving, support with solving, and in doing so, we had raised children who learned to take rather than appreciate. Christmas approached like a test I wasn't sure I was prepared to take. For the first time in decades, none of my children had mentioned visiting, though the requests for holiday financial help had arrived right on schedule. Sarah needed money for gifts. Michael wanted assistance with a vacation to give his family memories they'd treasure forever. And Emma was facing another crisis that could only be resolved with my intervention. I made a decision that felt both cruel and necessary. I would say no to all of them. Not out of anger, but out of love for who they could become if they were forced to find their own solutions. The phone calls that followed my refusals were revealing in ways that broke my heart while confirming my suspicions. Sarah's response was immediate and harsh. "Dad, I don't understand why you're being so selfish all of a sudden. We're family. We're supposed to help each other." But I noticed she defined help as a one-way transaction, flowing from me to her, never questioning what she might offer in return. When I suggested she visit instead of sending money, the conversation grew cold quickly. Michael's reaction was more calculated. He questioned my mental state, suggested I might need help managing my finances, implied that my decision-making was compromised by grief and age. It was a masterful manipulation, designed to make me doubt my own judgment while positioning himself as the reasonable, concerned son. But I had spent decades teaching critical thinking, and I recognized rhetoric when I heard it. Emma's response was the most painful, because it was wrapped in emotional manipulation that felt both genuine and calculated. "Ed," she pleaded. She painted pictures of Christmas morning disappointment and children who wouldn't understand why Grandpa had suddenly stopped caring about their happiness. Her tears were real, but so was her assumption that my money was her birthright. Christmas came and went, without visits, without phone calls, without the usual requests for assistance. The silence was deafening, but it was also clarifying. My children's absence spoke louder than their words ever had, confirming that our relationship had indeed been reduced to a financial arrangement rather than an emotional bond. I spent Christmas Day alone, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel lonely. There's a difference between being alone and being used, between solitude and exploitation. The quiet of my house felt peaceful rather than oppressive, filled with the dignity of a man who had finally chosen self-respect over the illusion of love purchased with money. The new year arrived with a clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. I understood now that my greatest failure as a father hadn't been in giving too little, but in giving too much. I had robbed my children of the satisfaction that comes from earning their own way, the confidence that develops through solving their own problems, the gratitude that emerges when help is rare and therefore precious. But understanding the problem was only the first step. I was 81 years old, facing the reality that I might not have enough years left to rebuild relationships that had been constructed on faulty foundations. The question that haunted me wasn't whether I could change my children's behavior. At their age, that seemed unlikely. But whether I could leave behind a legacy that might teach them lessons they had refused to learn while I was alive. That's when I began to think seriously about my will, about the final statement I would make as a father, the last lesson I would try to teach. It wouldn't be about punishment or revenge. It would be about love expressed through boundaries, about the difference between enabling and supporting, about the truth that the greatest inheritances can't be deposited in a bank account. The answer to my dilemma came from an unexpected source, my neighbor, Mrs. Rose Chen, a widow in her 70s who had been living next door for the past 15 years. I had always been polite to her, exchanging pleasantries over the fence, helping with her garbage cans during the winter, but I hadn't really seen her until I started paying attention to what real kindness looked like. After Margaret's death, Rose had appeared at my door every few weeks with containers of soup, homemade bread, or simply an invitation to sit on her porch and watch the sunset. She never asked for anything in return, never mentioned her own struggles with loneliness or her fixed income. She gave from abundance of spirit rather than abundance of wealth. I began to notice other acts of genuine care that I had been too absorbed in my own problems to recognize. Rose shoveled my sidewalk during snowstorms, brought in my mail when I was sick with flu, and always had time to listen when I needed to talk about Margaret. Her presence in my life had been a gift I hadn't acknowledged, kindness I hadn't reciprocated, love I hadn't appreciated. Watching Rose, I understood what my children had forgotten or perhaps never learned, that real relationships are built on mutual care, consistent presence, and the simple act of showing up without expecting anything in return. She visited me because she enjoyed my company, not because she needed my resources. She offered help because she cared about my well-being, not because she was positioning herself for future benefits. This realization crystallized something that had been forming in my mind for months. The decision about my will wasn't just about who deserved my money. It was about who had demonstrated the values I wanted to celebrate, who had shown me what love looked like when it wasn't complicated with financial expectations, who had earned my gratitude through actions rather than birthright. I made an appointment with my lawyer on a cold February morning, carrying with me a decision that felt both radical and perfectly logical. James Morrison had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years, had helped Margaret and I draft our original will, and knew the history of my family's financial dynamics better than anyone outside the situation. "George," he said, settling behind, and his desk with the grave expression lawyers wear when discussing mortality, "I want to make sure you've thought this through completely. Changing your will at this stage, given the current family dynamics, is going to create significant emotional fallout. Are you prepared for the consequences?" I had spent months preparing for those consequences, understanding that this decision would likely end any pretense of relationship with my children, at least in the short term. But I had also come to understand that those relationships, as they currently existed, weren't worth preserving. They were built on false foundations, sustained by manipulation, and devoid of the mutual respect that real love requires. "James," I replied, "I've spent the last 3 years being a father to 3 people who only remember I exist when they need money. I've enabled their dependency, rewarded their selfishness, and confused financial support with parental love. This isn't about punishment or money. It's my last attempt to teach what I failed to enforce while I lived, that love needs boundaries to remain love, and help without accountability turns into harm." The new will was simple in its structure, but profound in its implications. The bulk of my estate, the house, the investments, the savings account that my children had viewed as their eventual inheritance, would go to Rose Chen, with instructions that she use it to continue the kind of quiet kindness she had shown me, perhaps by supporting other elderly people who had been forgotten by their families. Along with the legal documents, I wrote 3 letters to my children, each one personalized but carrying the same essential message. These wouldn't be angry letters or vindictive explanations, but rather the words of a father trying to give his children one final gift: the truth about love, respect, and the difference between being needed and being valued. "My dear Sarah," the first letter began, "by the time you read this, you will have discovered that your inheritance is not what you expected. I hope you will read these words not as a punishment, but as the culmination of a lesson I have been trying to teach for years but didn't have the courage to enforce while I was alive. I explained the pattern I had documented, the mathematics of our relationship, the way their love had become conditional on my willingness to solve their problems with money. I described the loneliness of being valued only for what I could provide, the sadness of watching my children become people who took rather than gave, who demanded rather than appreciated. But the letters weren't just about their failures, they were about mine as well. I acknowledged that I had enabled their dependency, that my fear of losing them had prevented me from teaching them the values Margaret and I had intended to instill. I had confused love with indulgence, support with enabling, and in doing so, I had done them a disservice that had lasted into their middle age. "The money I am leaving to Rose," I wrote, "represents more than financial assets. It represents a recognition of the kind of person I hoped you might become, someone who gives without expecting, who cares without conditions, who shows up not because they need something, but because they value the relationship itself." The final paragraphs of each letter carried the same message, the heart of what I hoped they might understand someday, even if that understanding came too late to rebuild our relationship. This wasn't about money, and it never had been. It was about the kind of people we choose to become, the way we treat those who love us, and the legacy we create through our daily actions. "I am not angry with you," I wrote, "but I am disappointed in the people we became together. You as adult children who learned to take, and me as a father who never learned to say no. Perhaps if we had more time, we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial dependency. But time is the one thing I cannot give you more of." I explained that Rose had earned this inheritance not through biology, but through behavior. She had demonstrated the values of gratitude, kindness, and genuine care that I had hoped to see in my own children. She had treated me with dignity when I felt forgotten, with compassion when I felt alone, and with respect that wasn't tied to my bank account. "My greatest hope," the letters concluded, "is that this decision will teach you that the most valuable inheritance could not. That the most valuable inheritance anyone can receive is the knowledge of how to love without conditions, give without expectations, and care without calculating the cost. These are lessons I failed to teach you while I lived, but perhaps my death can accomplish what my life could not." I sealed the letters with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of finality. These would be my last words to the children I had raised, loved, and ultimately failed to prepare for lives of genuine independence and gratitude. Whether they learned from this lesson or simply resented it would be their choice to make. George Whitman passed away peacefully on a spring morning, 6 months after changing his will. Rose Chen found him in his garden, where he had been tending the roses Margaret had planted years before. He died as he had lived his final months, with dignity, surrounded by beauty, and at peace with the difficult decisions he had made. The reading of the will took place on a gray Tuesday afternoon, with Sarah, Michael, and Emma gathered in James Morrison's office, expecting to discuss the division of an estate they had long considered their birthright. The shock on their faces when the lawyer explained their father's final decision was profound, evolving quickly from disbelief to anger to something approaching grief. Rose Chen, who had been asked to attend the reading, sat quietly as the lawyer explained George's reasoning. She had been as surprised as anyone to learn of her inheritance, having genuinely cared for her neighbor without any expectation of reward. Her tears were not of joy for the money, but of sadness for a man who had felt so alone that he turned to a neighbor for the love his own children couldn't provide. The letters George had written were read aloud, each word carrying the weight of a father's final attempt to teach lessons his children had resisted learning. Some of those words found their mark, others found on hearts too hardened by years of entitlement to allow new understanding to take root. The 3 siblings left the lawyer's office forever changed, though whether that change would lead to growth or simply to greater resentment remained to be seen. In the end, George Whitman's true legacy wasn't found in his will or his money, but in the example he had finally found the courage to set. He had chosen to reward kindness over kinship, compassion over convenience, and authentic care over biological obligation. His final act as a father was to demonstrate that love, when it's real, doesn't require payment. And when it does require payment, it isn't really love at all. For those with eyes to see and hearts willing to learn, this became his greatest gift, the understanding that the most precious things we can leave behind are not found in bank accounts, but in the way we choose to love and be loved while we're here. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Voices After 50 for more true emotional tales about family, forgiveness, and the meaning of love. And before you go, watch the next story on our channel, another heartfelt reminder that the greatest legacy we can leave is kindness itself.